What kind of ruler grows her enemies instead of killing them? What kind of queen feeds them to flowers? In the heart of the palace stood a garden no servant dared enter without orders, because one wrong step, one wrong breath, could kill you. This wasn't a place for beauty. This was a weapon disguised as paradise. Petals painted in colors so bright they looked alive. Roots that could drink a man's blood dry. Air so sweet it burned your lungs. Here, the queen didn't need soldiers or swords. She could make you vanish with a bouquet, and once you passed the gates, you were already hers. What if the deadliest place in the palace looked like an invitation? The queen's poison garden didn't hide its danger. It dressed it in gold. The gate was carved from pale cedar, smooth as silk, and scented faintly of honey. It didn't smell like death, it smelled like trust. 2 guards stood on either side, still as statues. Were they protecting you from the garden, or the garden from you? Once you stepped past them, you weren't a guest anymore. You were a subject in the queen's most private experiment. Above the archway, her emblem glimmered in the light, a serpent coiled around a rose. Beauty strangled by venom. Or maybe venom disguised as beauty. Why would a ruler even need a place like this? That answer was written in the soil beyond the gate. The path ahead was narrow, winding just enough to hide what lay ahead. Hedges loomed over you, walls of green that whispered when the wind passed through. Every turn erased the thought of turning back. And there was no lock on that gate. There didn't need to be. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed warmer, thicker, sweet enough to cling to the back of your throat. The faint hum you heard wasn't bees. The warmth on your skin wasn't sunlight alone. You could feel eyes on you, only they weren't human. Somewhere deeper in the garden, something was already awake and waiting. You heard it before you saw it, the faintest shift, like fabric brushing against stone. The hedges curved open, and suddenly the path widened into a clearing bathed in dappled light. For a heartbeat, you almost believed it was beautiful. Then you noticed the ground. The soil here was darker, richer, almost red. The first plant rose from it like a crown, wide leaves, glistening as if polished. The veins running through them the color of old blood. It wasn't just dew on the surface. Dew didn't stain. You stepped closer and saw the truth. The moisture was sticky. They called it the blood vine. Not because it drank yours outright, but because it made you give it willingly. A single touch left invisible scratches in the skin, and hours later, you'd feel the bleeding start slow, steady, impossible to clot. The plant didn't kill you instantly. It made you carry your death out of the garden in your own veins. And that was just the one you could see. The queen's favorites were the ones you couldn't. Small blossoms, no bigger than a coin, crouched low to the earth, their petals cupped upward like tiny bowls. Their perfume was soft, almost pleasant until you breathed it for too long. The scent clung to your lungs, blooming into a cough that tore the lining of your throat. Within a day, your voice was gone. Within 3, so was your life. Why plant something that killed so slowly? Because it left time for the queen to watch. She could stroll the balcony above, sipping wine while you smiled at her, still believing the headache was just the heat, still believing you'd walk away. The deeper you went, the more the plants seemed to lean toward you, as if sensing your movement. The colors were wrong here, purples too deep, greens too sharp, yellows so bright they almost hurt your eyes. Every shape and shade felt exaggerated, deliberate, as though the garden had been designed to make you forget what was natural. And yet, the true horror wasn't the look of the plants, it was the silence between them. No birds sang here, no insects hummed. Even the breeze felt heavy, as if it thought twice before disturbing the leaves. Something in this place ate not just life, but sound. You told yourself you could turn back, but the path was gone. The hedges had closed behind you, the air pressing forward, guiding you deeper. Somewhere ahead, a flicker of red caught your eye brighter than any flower should be. And with it, the first movement that wasn't your own. They said the queen didn't need an executioner, she grew her own. Every stalk, every petal in that garden had a purpose, and none of them were innocent. Some poisoned your blood before you left the path. Some starved your lungs while you slept. And some didn't just kill you, they made you vanish. No grave, no body, no trace. Just the memory of walking through a cedar gate and never walking back out. Because here, death wasn't a sentence. It was a performance. And the Queen never missed opening night. You saw him before he saw you, or maybe he saw you first and wanted you to think otherwise. A man in plain linen, knees deep in the soil, his hands moving with the slow precision of someone who had nothing to fear here. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. Anyone who worked in the Queen's poison garden didn't need weapons, they were standing in one. At first, you thought he was just a servant. Then you noticed the scars. Faint white lines running along his forearms, almost symmetrical, like a pattern burned into him on purpose. And the gloves, not thick leather for protection, but thin silk, fine enough that the plants could still feel the warmth of his skin. Why would you wear gloves that didn't protect you? Because protection wasn't the point. Contact was. He reached for a vine with leaves shaped like tiny daggers, curling them gently between his fingers. It responded like an animal, tightening slightly, almost shivering in his grasp. That's when it hit you. He wasn't tending to the plants. He was training them. These were the Queen's gardeners, a title that sounded harmless until you realized what it really meant. They were poison keepers, handlers of living weapons, caretakers of death, and they didn't just know every plant by name. They knew how long each one took to kill. They knew what symptoms would appear first. They knew which ones left no trace in the blood at all. One of them glanced at you and smiled, but it wasn't a welcome. It was a measurement. You felt it, in the way his eyes lingered, not on your face, but on the veins in your wrists, the color of your skin, the pace of your breathing, like he was choosing which plant would suit you best. They moved in silence, communicating with nods and tiny gestures. A brush of fingers along a stem, a tilt of the head toward a shaded corner. The language of the gardeners wasn't meant for outsiders. Some said they could wake a plant with nothing but a whisper, coaxing it to release its toxins into the air without ever being touched. And the most horrifying rumor? That the gardeners themselves were immune. That they had been dosed, slowly, over years, their blood carrying enough venom to kill a normal man with a single scratch. If that was true, they weren't just dangerous inside the garden, they were dangerous everywhere. You noticed the tools at their belts, not shovels or shears, but small bone-handled knives, their edges stained in ways that didn't look like rust, not for pruning, for grafting, for taking a part of one plant and joining it to another, building hybrids that no one outside these walls had ever seen. Hybrids the Queen herself may not have named yet. She didn't have to, the gardeners knew exactly what she wanted from them. One knelt to tend a cluster of deep violet flowers. The petals trembled as his shadow passed over them, releasing a faint puff into the air. You felt the scent brush your face, sweet at first, then metallic, sharp enough to make your jaw tighten. The gardener didn't flinch. His lungs, his blood, his skin all conditioned to survive what would cripple you in an hour. Why keep such men alive? Because they were more than caretakers. They were the executioners no one saw coming. A servant with a gift from the garden could walk anywhere in the palace and never be questioned. A sprig in a wine jug, a blossom sewn into a sleeve, a single leaf in a bath. The Queen's enemies didn't have to step foot inside the garden to die by it. The man in silk, gloves straightened, brushing soil from his hands, and for the briefest moment his eyes met yours again. Not curious, not hostile, just certain. And you realized you weren't watching him work. He was watching you react, measuring how close you were to breathing in too much, how near you were to touching the wrong leaf. You turned to find the path again, but the hedges had shifted, not by accident. The gardeners knew when to open the way forward and when to close it. Somewhere ahead, the air shimmered in the heat, heavy with the perfume of unseen flowers. And you began to wonder if the Queen's plants could kill with a touch or a breath. What would happen when she served them at her table? The Queen's banquets were famous for their beauty. Gold-threaded tapestries hung from the walls. Chandeliers dripped with crystal. Dishes arrived on silver platters so polished you could see your own fear in them. But what the guests never understood, at least, not until it was too late, was that the real performance wasn't the music or the dancers. It was the food. Every ingredient on the table had a story, and in the Queen's palace, stories could kill. She never served simple bread or common wine. She served colors no one had ever seen in a kitchen before, meat glazed in iridescent pinks, sauces the shade of crushed rubies, garnishes so bright they looked painted on. If you were wise, you didn't ask where they came from. But tonight, the garden had followed you here. Not in vines or petals, but in the smallest details, a curl of herb draped over roasted quail, a single blossom floating in a crystal goblet. These weren't decorations. They were decisions, and only the Queen knew which guest each one belonged to. The courtiers leaned in, smiling at her every word, not realizing the deeper game being played. Some took careful bites, testing the flavors, while others, eager to please, ate with reckless enthusiasm. You could see the gardener's work in every mouthful. A pale green sauce that looked harmless until your lips began to tingle. A wine that seemed sweeter with every sip, until the sweetness thickened in your throat. Why kill a man in public? Because here, death could be disguised as indulgence. Because a victim who collapses with a smile looks less like a target and more like a weakling. Because every guest watching knows what might be hidden in their own plate. The Queen sat at the head of the table, her eyes never staying on one person for long. She spoke in gentle tones, as if discussing the weather, even as her gaze flicked to the servers. Gardeners in court dress, silk gloves, hiding hands that had touched things most men wouldn't dare to look at. They poured wine, replaced plates, adjusted candles. Every movement was rehearsed, every placement exact. And then it began. A merchant from the western provinces paused, mid-laugh, blinking too slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for his cup. A noblewoman's cheeks flushed bright, her breathing quickening as she fanned herself. Across the table, a diplomat from the coast stopped speaking altogether, staring into the distance as if trying to remember his own name. None of them screamed. That was the genius of the Queen's harvest. It didn't need to be violent. It was elegance turned lethal. By the time the first servant stepped forward to escort the merchant away for rest, half the table knew exactly what had happened, and the other half wondered if they were next. You didn't dare touch your plate. Not when you'd seen what lived in that garden. But refusing to eat was as dangerous as taking the wrong bite. The Queen noticed everything. A full plate might be taken as insult, a lack of trust, a declaration that you didn't believe yourself safe in her court. And in her world, believing you were safe was part of the test. A soft laugh escaped her lips as she leaned toward a visiting prince, plucking a petal from her own glass and placing it into his. He hesitated, then drank because when a queen offers you a piece of herself, you don't refuse. His hand never left the stem of the goblet, even as his face grew pale. The music swelled, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to breathe together a collective inhale, heavy with perfume and heat. You could feel the garden here, its roots stretched unseen, its whispers carried in the scent of the flowers arranged on the tables, its poison dancing in crystal and gold. No one left the banquet early. That was the rule. You stayed until the Queen rose from her seat, and when she did, the servants began to clear the plates with the same quiet grace they had set them down. The dishes disappeared, the smells faded, and the danger left with them, or so the survivors liked to believe. But you knew better, because you'd seen the way her eyes lingered on certain guests as they bowed their good nights. The banquet was over. The poison wasn't. And somewhere deep inside the palace, in the cedar shadows of the garden, new blossoms were opening, already waiting for their next meal. They called them survivors, but that wasn't the truth. Not in the Queen's world. Surviving the banquet didn't mean escaping her reach, it meant carrying her mark. And some marks didn't kill you right away. They just waited. The first signs were subtle. A headache that pulsed behind the eyes. A metallic taste at the back of the tongue. Fingers trembling when you tried to write your name. Most people ignored them, thinking they'd simply eaten too much, or that the wine had been stronger than they realized. That was the point. By the time the sickness revealed itself, it was already too late to trace it back to the plate it came from. You'd see it in the corridors the morning after. courtiers moving slower than usual, leaning against marble columns for balance. Servants carrying trays past them, pretending not to notice. The Queen's court ran on the unspoken rule that you never acknowledged someone else's weakness because today it was theirs. Tomorrow, it could be yours. Some poisons worked like a storm, quick, violent, over in hours. But the ones from the garden were patient. They crept through the body like vines under stone, finding the smallest cracks and taking root. One courtier was said to have lived for 3 months after the banquet, smiling at every gathering, attending every feast, while his blood slowly turned black beneath his skin. By the end, they said, he could no longer feel the difference between cold and heat. Why would the Queen let someone linger that long? Because every day he walked among them, every handshake, every shared drink, was a reminder that no one could be sure they were safe. Fear was more contagious than any poison she grew. Some survivors didn't die at all. At least, not in the physical sense. They disappeared in other ways, memory clouded, thoughts slipping like water through their fingers. One nobleman, once known for his sharp wit, began forgetting names, then faces, then why he was speaking at all. He wandered the palace like a ghost, bowing to the same people twice in a row. When he was finally sent away to his estate, he left without a fight. Some said the Queen had given him a gift, the chance to live without remembering what he'd seen. Others believed it was the cruelest death of all, losing yourself while your heart still beat. And then there were those who weren't targets at all. They'd been spared the banquet's main course, but they'd sat close enough to inhale the faint perfumes rising from the Queen's arrangements. Even a whisper of the garden could plant itself in you. It might take years to bloom, or it might never, but once you'd breathed it, you could never be sure. One woman, a visiting envoy from a neighboring kingdom, believed she had escaped untouched. She returned home, spoke nothing of the garden, and lived quietly for 5 years. Then, on the day of her eldest son's wedding, she collapsed without warning, her veins blooming in dark violet patterns up her arms. There was no cure, and no doubt where it had come from. The garden didn't need to be near to claim you. It only needed to be remembered. The survivors carried another burden: suspicion. Every guest who had shared that banquet watched them closely afterward, wondering if they had been spared or if they were simply biding their time. A survivor might be an ally, or a ticking clock. Some leaned into that fear. One merchant began wearing a single black petal in his lapel at every gathering, saying nothing about it but never taking it off. His rivals kept their distance, convinced he'd been gifted something from the garden that could be used on them. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In the Queen's court, perception was as deadly as truth. You learned quickly that surviving the garden didn't mean freedom. It meant being part of its shadow, an unspoken extension of its reach. You carried it in your scent, in the way people's eyes flicked to your hands before shaking them, in the way conversations faltered when you entered the room. Some nights, walking the palace corridors, you'd swear you could smell it again, that faint sweetness under the stone, the whisper of something green and dangerous breathing just out of sight. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was still inside you. And in that quiet, you understood the truth. The garden's work didn't end when you left it. It ended when it wanted to. Somewhere, behind cedar gates you would never see again, the blossoms opened their petals to the moonlight. And though you were far away, you felt them as if they were blooming inside you. The Queen's poison garden wasn't just her weapon, it was her trap. And the ones who fell into it most eagerly were the people who thought they could use it against her. Every ruler had enemies. Most came with steel in the dark, or armies at the border. But some came with a subtler plan. They thought the garden could be turned, that the same blossoms that silenced her rivals could be made to silence her. These were the assassins, thieves of breath and blood, who came not to destroy the garden, but to steal from it. It never ended well. The first mistake was believing the garden could be entered without her knowing. The cedar gate was always watched, but the true sentinels weren't the guards. They were the plants themselves. The hedges along the outer path were woven with a creeping vine that could sense a change in the air. New sweat, new fear. By the time an intruder reached the inner circle, the gardeners were already in motion. One assassin, a man trained in poisons since boyhood, slipped through the palace kitchens under the cover of a festival. He carried silver shears and a pouch lined with waxed cloth to keep the flowers fresh. He thought he knew exactly what he was looking for, a blossom that could kill in a single breath. But when he found it, the petals closed as his hand approached, folding tight like a fist. That was when the shadow fell over him. The gardeners didn't shout. They didn't run. They moved like the closing of a door. What happened next was never spoken of in the open. But months later, a new plant appeared along the southern path, a low, curling shrub with leaves shaped like human fingers. Some said they recognized the scar on one of them. Others tried different tactics. One came disguised as a servant, offering to help with the tending of the rarest plants. The queen allowed it. She even commended his dedication when he knelt to work the soil. Only he didn't know that the plant he'd been sent to water drank more than moisture. Its roots carried a venom so potent that even touching the water it had absorbed could stop a heart. When they found him, his face was still bowed, his hands sunk deep into the earth. Why did the queen allow them to try? Because each attempt was a lesson to the rest. You didn't attack her garden without becoming part of it, and she made sure the story of each failure was told not in words, but in the way her plants grew. Some would say she even staged these failures for her own amusement. There was the case of two brothers who plotted to poison her wine during a midsummer feast. They thought they could hide the toxin in the sweetness of a vintage from the western coast. The queen smiled when she drank it. She even toasted their health. By the end of the night, they were both dead. The wine had been poured for them as well, drawn from the same bottle they had prepared. The queen had simply replaced the vintage with a tincture of her own making, one that would only take effect when mixed with the exact poison they had brought. She didn't just defend herself. She turned their own blades back on them. The most chilling tale came from a man known only as the Whisperer, a mercenary who claimed to have never failed a job. He was said to have entered the garden at night, guided by moonlight and instinct. He walked its paths for hours without being stopped. He even found the central courtyard, where the rarest plants bloomed under silver lanterns. By morning, he was gone. No trace, no body, just his boots, neatly placed by the gate. Weeks later, at a royal banquet, the queen unveiled a new centerpiece, a towering plant with long, spiraling tendrils and a faintly human scent to its flowers. The courtiers whispered about the resemblance of its twisting roots to a man's spine. The queen never confirmed it. She didn't need to. The garden's hunger wasn't just for those who came uninvited. Sometimes, the queen herself sent invitations. A sealed letter, a personal audience, a walk through the palace grounds, all leading, eventually, to the Cedar Gate. The guests believed they were being honored. They didn't realize they were bait. Those who escaped, if they could be called that, never returned to court. Some vanished into exile. Others stayed close to home, never touching a flower again. And a few became whispers themselves, warning anyone who dared to plot against the queen that her garden wasn't just a weapon. It was an execution ground that wrote its own epitaphs in leaves and roots. One of those whispers still circulates today. You can't kill a woman who grows her own death. The queen understood the deepest truth of power. It wasn't about being untouchable. It was about making every attempt to touch you a suicide. Her enemies thought the garden was a place. It was a trap, and for those who entered it, it was also a grave. Somewhere beyond the Cedar Gate, in that air heavy with perfume and silence, the plants still wait. They've learned the scent of fear. They've learned the rhythm of footsteps that hesitate. And they've learned that when the queen wants someone gone, she doesn't need to send soldiers. She only needs to open the gate. And once you step inside, the garden always closes behind you. The queen's death should have ended it. That's what her enemies believed, that without her, the garden would wither, the poisons lose their power, the fear dissolve like mist in the morning sun. But the garden didn't mourn her. It didn't fade. It grew. Her cedar gates remained locked. Her gardeners vanished into the shadows of history. And yet, every year, another story would surface. A courtier from a far-off land who died with violet veins spreading up his arms. a merchant who collapsed after sipping wine from a golden cup, a noblewoman found in her bed with her lips blackened as if by frost. None of them had ever stepped inside the queen's garden, but all of them carried its touch. How could the garden kill without its queen? Some said she had trained her gardeners too well, that they had scattered across kingdoms, carrying seeds in hidden pouches, planting them in secret courtyards and behind palace walls. Others whispered that the garden itself had become sentient, its roots stretching beyond the palace grounds, slipping under city streets, blooming in places where no one dared to dig too deep. The most unsettling theory was that the garden had been built not just from plants, but from people. Those who had vanished assassins, rivals, traitors weren't just buried there. They were absorbed. Their flesh, their blood, their very memories fed into the soil, giving the plants a hunger that outlasted any gardener's hand. If that was true, the queen's death was irrelevant. The garden didn't need her anymore. Artifacts from her reign began to surface: cups etched with curling vines, knives with handles carved from unfamiliar wood, jars of powder that smelled faintly of honey and metal. They fetched staggering prices in black markets, despite the fact that owning one was often a death sentence. You didn't have to drink from the cup or cut yourself with the knife. Simply touching them could be enough. One such artifact became infamous: a thin silver comb set with dark green stones. It was beautiful, delicate, and entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye, until the duchess who wore it collapsed at a ball, her hair falling out in clumps as her skin turned the pale green of rotting leaves. When the comb was examined, they found its teeth were carved from the stems of a plant that hadn't been seen since the queen's reign. Who was doing this? No one could say. Some believed the last of the gardeners had sworn a vow to keep her enemies dying long after she was gone, ensuring her power lived forever in the most terrifying way possible. Others believed the garden was simply using them, calling to anyone foolish enough to answer. And then there were the seeds, small, black, and so smooth they looked like drops of polished stone. They began to appear in locked rooms, in sealed chests, in the pockets of men and women who swore they had never touched the garden. You could throw them away, burn them, crush them to dust, it didn't matter. The seeds always seemed to return, and in places where they were left too long, the air would begin to change. Sweet at first, then heavy, then deadly. One story told of a city far from the queen's homeland where an abandoned courtyard became overgrown overnight. The plants were nothing like the local flora leaves, shaped like blades, flowers that pulsed faintly in the dark. By morning, 3 families who lived near the courtyard were dead. When the city guard tried to clear the plants, the vines bled. The king who replaced the queen eventually ordered the garden destroyed. The gates were broken, the soil turned, the plants burned. But those who were there said the fire didn't smell like burning wood, it smelled like meat, and the ash left behind clung to the skin in oily streaks that took days to wash away. Even after the garden was reduced to blackened earth, the deaths continued, not as often, but enough to keep the fear alive. Enough to make people whisper that the garden had never really been inside the palace at all. It had always been inside the people who feared it. What was the garden now? A curse? A memory? A piece of the queen herself that refused to rot? The answer didn't matter, because in the end, her enemies were still dying, her name was still spoken in fear, and the garden's legend had grown beyond her reach. In the archives of a distant monastery, a single page remains from a book thought to have been written by one of the gardeners. The ink is faded, the words written in a script no one fully recognizes. But one sentence is clear, burned into the page as if by fire. Roots are patient, they wait, and when they wake, they remember. Some believe the garden is still waiting, that every seed, every petal, every root hidden in the cracks of stone is just biding its time. That one day, when the air is right and the sun falls in the same way it did on the day the queen first walked its paths, it will return not as a place, but as a season that doesn't end until every last enemy is gone, and when that day comes, there will be no cedar gates to keep it contained. Somewhere, in a courtyard no one remembers planting, A single flower blooms tonight. Its scent drifts on the wind, slipping through windows and under doors, unnoticed at first. It smells like nothing more than spring. But in the queen's shadow, even spring can kill.